What's going on, guys? What up? What up? The moment has arrived. It's the moment of truth, I say. What's going on, A? Those of you that kind of remember me coming on live here today, or those of you that actually joined yesterday, you kind of heard me mention yesterday. I said today was going to be relatively either it was going to be a strong kind of tread day, or it was going to end up being a choppy day, right? I can say the trend was actually pretty significant to one direction per se, but overall, I think this was relatively a choppy day. Unless you picked the right ticker per se, I think it was overall very choppy. What's going on, Renee? Kind of what popped out to me, kind of just in the get go, giving you what popped out in terms of just from the moment I woke up and looking at how the market was looking at setting up pre market. The first thing that stood out to me was the entire semiconductor space. That was what stood out to me first. There was basically one headline, one analyst rating that came out per se, and it was basically about Micron cutting their forward guidance. That pretty much was an onslaught to basically be a caveat to what we had already had with Nvidia having their bad earnings. So when I actually added that up, one plus one, Micron having cutting their forward guidance, then Nvidia also being in, I want to say, a downturn from their earnings, it felt fitting that we were likely going to see some kind of broader market weakness because of the semiconductor space. And that's what actually caught my attention earlier on. And that's exactly what ended up happening. I popped on live pretty earlier on. And I actually mentioned the fact that I was looking at NVIDIA. That was pretty much a beautiful breakdown. I saw AMD even when SPY started to give us a nice little bounce and earlier chop earlier on in the morning. We saw AMD continuing to press in the lows. We saw NVIDIA continuing to press in the lows and Micron. So that was particularly to me the space you really wanted to be in to get the bigger move to the downside. Otherwise, obviously, you can always point to Tesla. Tesla usually trades within such a wide range that you can usually get a good enough move off of it. But considering how bloody the market was overall, I think Tesla was rather a little bit choppy as well per se. So that was something we saw pretty much where your relative strength was overall. You saw Apple, you saw Microsoft, and that was actually the reason why the market did not bleed out more so than what it should have. Is because we saw Microsoft and Apple basically holding up relatively well, and that was your relative strength. So that's what actually stood out to me earlier on in the morning. But other than that, just kind of seeing the semiconductor space go down, I knew that we were likely going to end up leading bearish. But then actually seeing Apple and Microsoft hold up, that's what gave me that sigh of, not trying to press into the short because they were actually consideringly holding up well, even when the market started to take further steps downward. All right. So that's just hindsight what I was looking at. Now getting into structure of SPY ahead of CPI data. Now there's no exact way of where the market's gonna go exactly, especially when it's so news based in terms of how the structure is setting up right now. Obviously, the first thing that stands out is you can see basically your little shadow area. You can see the ascending channel action that we had. We basically broke down off of that uptrend today, and you can see that we started to wedge right below it. So now here comes the tricky part. You can see I have a little bit of a megaphone. It might be a little bit of a stretch in terms of that megaphone structure, but I do think it aligns with how the wicks are and how the bottom little chop is on that bottom trend line support. So what I'm looking for tomorrow is to pretty much see if the market's going to end up trying to see if we can rip off of CPI data, which we have done historically. I'm going to look to see if we get a nice little pop off of that CPI data. I'm looking to basically retest what is basically going to should be acting as supply here, as our resistance here, and that's going to be roughly right around that 413 mark. If we see increasing strength depending upon the gap up pre-market, then we could pretty much determine whether we're going to end up stretching out towards 414, which would be at the top of the megaphone. So 413, 414, that's pretty much where I actually have the top particularly, and that's where I'm going to be looking for a reversal back to the downside here tomorrow. Otherwise, if we break north of 414, I think that sets us up for a bigger impulse to the upside here, and then we're going to start to talk towards 415 half. And then ultimately, I think that's when the bigger picture of 421 that everyone's been pretty much looking for is going to be coming into play. So that's pretty much the upside over 414. That's when we can start to talk about that further impulse to the upside. Otherwise, 414 should be my upside, and I think we end up seeing a pretty bloody day tomorrow. In terms of downside, the big level that's stood out to me pretty much the entire month so far has been 407. That's right into where I have current demand sitting at, as that 407 level. We could probably wake down as low as 406.81 is what I'm showing as for a hard support level. Otherwise, you break down below that 406.81, that's when it really starts to get brutal, and we're really going to start to see the market even dump more aggressively. So, conservatively, we should end up tapping that 407 mark. That's where I have for downside. That's where I would expect the market's going to try and hold, that bulls are going to try and defend. Otherwise, if bulls can't defend that 407 mark, it's going to get nasty. And that's when hopefully you're positioned for the short, or you're likely on the sideline just trying to wait for the market to find its relative short term bottom. All right. So that's pretty much just giving you flip sides north and south. I did mention about NVIDIA, so I should end up showing you a chart that I was particularly looking at. You had the nice little wedge that you broke down from when we ended up having that early earnings released and we gapped down off of that. So I did see that pretty much continuing to break down. We saw this pretty much nice little zigzag. We tried to reclaim halfway in the mark off of that gap down. And then you basically saw the leg down is what I was basically looking at. You already had the retest. That was basically your 50% retracement from the gap down. And then you started to break down right off of this key support level of that 175 half that you gapped down. So there was no retrace necessarily. It was just a beautiful breakdown. And you saw the flush right when once you ended up breaking below 172, and that started to get aggressive until you got the nice little bottoming. All right, so this was one I'm going to continue to watch it here. I think we could get a little bit more of a pop here, and this is why I say SPY leading up towards 413, 414. We could see a little bit more of an upside here going into tomorrow, in which what I'm looking for is to see if we end up getting some kind of like head and shoulders type formation. Retest the supply here right on this 176 mark is what I'm going to look for. And then I'm going to look to see if we get the reverse off of that 176 in that supply. And we should end up starting to curl right back down tomorrow morning. All right, so that's another one. I'm going to continue to stay locked in on pretty much looking at the semis in terms of their weakness. AMD was pretty much another one. I have a nice little megaphone action. I think it's a pretty broad megaphone, but nonetheless, it is making a megaphone here. It went right into my demand zone as I was pretty much watching this melt for most of the day. We ended up retesting it right at that 95 half mark is where we end up closing. So I'm gonna look to see if we can pretty much reclaim that. I would handily expect us to reclaim it, and then your next supply that you're looking above that will be right around this 97 half is what I'm looking at. So if I pretty much just move this up right around that 97 half, I'm particularly looking to pay pretty much stretch up to that level, and that's where I would expect to relatively see as our overhead resistance tomorrow morning, and then we should see the leg down, and I would expect to basically break south of this megaphone. All right, so that's one I'll continue to watch as well. Apple, this thing has just been a monster. I think we all know how Apple's particularly looked the past few days, few months, if you want to say that. But we're finally at a point where we're actually just kind of resting right at this halfway mark of this overall ascending channel action. Now, the key is at what point we end up breaking this halfway mark of the ascending channel, and at what point, how aggressive it particularly starts to get. So, under this 164 mark, that's what I'm particularly looking for. Under 164, that's when we're going to start to talk about this gap fill here at 159 half. And that's going to be a pretty aggressive gap fill because that is about a near $2 gap fill that we're looking at towards the downside. And that would also put you at the bottom of this channel here, depending upon how aggressively this can get. That's the bigger question. I would anticipate that we likely test the gap fill if SPY can get down towards that 407 mark, but I don't particularly see that we end up filling it unless SPY ends up cracking below 407. That's what I'm kind of in the mindset here. So that's gonna be coming into the time of when the market starts to melt down and how aggressively it is, and I'll be able to pretty much determine how soon we enter that gap. All right. So I'll keep that on watch. Renee, you mentioned NCLH. I'll take a peep at it. They said they have earnings report this morning wasn't good, so it fell below my buy it price. It looks like someone had me look at it before, but I'm gonna clear the chart. Let's see what we actually have that we're looking at. So you are pretty much sitting right near support level. It kind of bounced right, pretty much off of it, if I want to say that. Let's see if I can pretty much get a little more of a determined support. Okay, no, not particularly. I think you have a little bit more weight to the downside here to particularly get to a more significant support level. But I would expect pretty much if you're looking for upside here, you're looking for this to basically break over 20 half, 12 half. Over 20.47, that's when you can start to test towards the gap fill over that 20.47, and you'll test the gap fill at 12.69. Otherwise, if you can't break north of 12.47, that's when you're going to come into this major support level here, and that's going to likely crack under that $12 mark, and you're going to come down towards 11.72. So 12.47 to me, I think that's pretty much your big level that you're looking at towards the upside here. Otherwise, that should end up being your resistance, and it's likely going to end up coming right back down, as I kind of have that little support trend line sitting right around 11.72. All right. So not too much to read into it just yet, given the fact that they had bad earnings. I don't. I'm hard pressed to say that you're gonna find any kind of momentum to build off of this. So if you're looking at maybe about $1 upside to test towards that gap fill ish, but otherwise I see limited upside, and I would take the under if you end up cracking below 11.72. That's when I think that you could start to pretty much lean into a short, and it should end up further breaking down, as I would see this coming down towards 11 flat particularly. All right. But nothing there that I want to say. I don't think there's enough meat on the bone to say that I'm swayed either one direction or the other. I would likely say if the market's going to break down here tomorrow, you likely see this break trendline support, and that's when you can likely lean into a bearish take. All right. Other than that, I know everyone's pretty much watching Tesla. I know Tesla's usually always at the top of the list. You have a little bit of a disgusting type of broadening wedge type action here on Tesla. I'm going to be looking to pretty much test our supply here. That's sitting right around this 868 mark. 868 is where I have my supply entering. I don't think you get past that 868 mark. I think that's where you're going to likely see this pretty much take a leg down even further from today's lows. And so 868, that's pretty much the big level for me overall. We'll see if we get that kind of leg up pre-market, or if it ends up happening within a few minutes of market open tomorrow. But 868, that's pretty much the big level for me mentally that I'm watching here. Otherwise, that's where I'm gonna look to see where we end up getting a hard reversal right back to the downside, and we should end up taking out today's low. All right, so that's one I'll continue to keep an eye on. Boeing, this is another one that I've been watching. I'm gonna keep an eye on this one as well, particularly for when it ends up breaking down. You have a little bit of an ascending channeling type of action. You're basing right at the halfway mark of this overall uptrend that we have with this channel. So if we end up flushing under 163 here, you do have a gap fill to be down towards 160. What is this? 160 point. Oh, 159.84. So about a near $3 gap fill that you're looking at towards the downside. And then obviously the support of this overall uptrend is down towards 153 half. That's what I'm looking at. So I like the downside here as well for Boeing, kind of in the same similar type of spot as Apple is, with their overall ascending channels is sitting right at the halfway mark of it. If it ends up taking a leg down, that should also get pretty much aggressive alongside Apple. All right. So that's pretty much just the gist of some of the names that I'm keeping an eye on in terms of downside. Let's see what the market really wants to give us. I know going into, I think today, I don't think that the uptrends looked as bad. I was kind of hoping that we would end up holding support of that overall uptrend on SPY. That was not necessarily the case. The fact that we ended up breaking overall uptrend is not particularly pretty. So pretty much a lot of tickers are just leaning towards the bear side. I saw the flow coming in pretty heavy for Tesla and Apple puts particularly, and if that ends up leading the way down, it's going to get rather disgusting, especially once SPY rolls over under 407. So that's just things to keep in mind. Let's see if the market gives us a little bit of a pump and dump type scenario, and I believe that we should particularly get a strong trend day, but rather to the downside. That's what I'm looking at in terms of how the structures are. A lot of uptrends being broken. That's the direction I'm leaning at. Otherwise, if we end up starting to really squeeze over that 414 half mark basically on SPY, that's when things pretty much flip, and we're going to see a lot of pretty much buying start to be accumulated, because then it's going to be the bear case scenario is likely going to end up failing. All right. But other than that, big data tomorrow. Data should be roughly out an hour before open, basically. So those of you East Coast, it's 8:30 a.m. Eastern. Let's see what they end up giving us, and then we'll go from there. All right. DK, you just joined in a little bit late there, my guy. I kind of just pretty much concluded our session today. But big level I'm watching tomorrow, 414. I think that's our max upside here tomorrow, 414. Otherwise, I'm looking for the rollover, and we likely end up seeing us take out today's low on SPY, and we should trade down to 407 rather easily tomorrow. Just given a lot of uptrends, particularly have been broken today. All right. Other than that, though, I'll leave it as is. We'll kind of wrap it up there. You guys have a